In the past, I've talked about why I think the current system, the political system, is likely to break down, just collapse. And I think people are coming around to that point of view. I think people more and more agree with that. I think people can see that the system is likely to collapse and break down. Every few weeks, a new bit of evidence comes out. I think the recent piece of evidence is the evidence for mass immigration, not just net immigration, but the total. I think 1.2 million coming in, 925,000 of those being non-EU. I mean, it's totally unsustainable. That is just a war against us. Any society that does that will collapse and deserves to. And I think people are starting to see that. What I've said will replace the system if it breaks down will be a kind of voluntary legal system that people subject themselves or submit to by joining voluntarily, basically by individuals collectivizing, acting collectively in order to abide by systems of law that people can trust. Signing up to a voluntary legal code under which you agree to treat other members of that legal code in a way that observes the laws provided for in that legal code, and having it enforced by the usual apparatus: police, judges, courts, bailiffs, prisons, etc. And I think this will be a way to provide for law and order, for protection, and to keep crime under control. Because if the state has fallen over, the state can't do that. The state can't provide law and order, so someone else has to. And I don't think the state will be able to get back up, because I think the reason for the state, the reason for people to submit to the state, the basis of the social contract has changed over the centuries, over the decades, and it is simply about welfare. And if the welfare state falls over, I think the state will fall over and it will no longer have any authority, won't be able to get up again. And in those circumstances, I think we will rediscover that the purpose of a legal system, a political system, is primarily about creating control and imposing law and order, which is valuable. And I think we will also discover that we all have an incentive to show that we are willing to subject ourselves to a system of law in order that other people can trust us, to have us live near them, and will trust us in order to be able to trade with us, so that we can have a job, so that we can buy and sell things. People, you can't get that from other forms of authority. So supposing the state falls over and people say, well, I'll submit to the local warlord, some drug gangster, or a rogue colonel, or some theocrat. Those things are unstable. They can't provide the fine legal protections that people want. What people want is a transparent system, a transparent, even-handed system, efficiently enforced, that people can understand and choose. And I think the way that people will do that is simply to have well thought through, well provided codes of law that people can sign up to and can say, yes, I want to be subject to this law. It might not be much, the legal provisions might not be all that different from the legal provisions that we have at the moment. The big difference being that the source of that law and the authority for imposing that law doesn't come from the overarching coercive state, because the overarching coercive state will no longer be there. But it comes from the fact that people en masse are willing to sign up to that legal system and voluntarily submit ourselves to it. And what I want to do here is to go through why I think that system will be a good thing, because partly it's unfamiliar, but also I think it's scary to people, because it envisages no taxman, no welfare state. I think that is a very deep-seated fear to a lot of people. And so what I want to do is to describe why I think a society that organises itself along the lines I'm suggesting, you could, as a shorthand, you can call it my system, why I think it will be a good system, what some of the benefits will be. Now, I just want to talk about three benefits. I could talk on and on about what I think might happen. I think that the first benefit will be a very effective method for the uncompromising, hard-line, intransigent, and a quite aggressive relentless reversal of the multicultural invasion, the rejection of multiculturalism and the widespread pervasive use of repatriation, in order that we, the English, can return to a situation where we, like other nations, we have our homeland that is ours and that we can enjoy. It is the only one we've got. We're not taking one off anyone else. We're simply saying we're no longer going to let you take it off us. And I think this is, in fact, the only way and the most efficient way, and certainly the most bloodless way to accomplish that. The second benefit, I think, will be for a much wealthier society, particularly for people at the bottom of the pile, at the bottom of the muck heap, who I think, and so in those to that extent, I think the creation of a more materially equal society, and thirdly, a more cultured society, both in sort of day-to-day cultural interaction, but also in as far as artistic culture goes as well, which is not to be underestimated. But I want to go through those three things in more detail. But what I think, before I do, what I want to talk about is various themes that I think are likely to emerge in a society that's organised like that, where people collectivise voluntarily, individually, joining and submitting to a legal system without that overarching, inescapable, coercive authority, without the state. Now, one theme I think will be what I would refer to as moral feedback loops, that people will start to do to behave in a more moral, you might say a more moralistic way. And the more people do that, the more they will do that. So think that these tendencies will snowball and enter into feedback loops. The next thing I think will be sort of self-reliance, the lack of the welfare state forcing people to provide for themselves, to rely on themselves, getting away from the degenerate welfare-induced idea that someone else, some other authority, they out there can provide for all your grown-up needs. Thirdly, the lack of a taxman. No taxman, no tax. Without the state, you don't have a taxman because you don't have the coercive apparatus for it. No one will voluntarily join a system which promises to take away 3/4 of their wealth or half their pay. People won't do that. Tax becomes voluntary. If tax is voluntary, it's not tax. A fourth thing I think will be the lack of a central bank. So states, they use their coercive power to have a monopoly over money and then impose a central bank which can then manipulate and control what people do with that money, can control the money supply and interest rates, etc., through a central banking authority. And a fifth thing I think will be the lack of imposed ideologies like feminism and multiculturalism. And finally, I think simply the lack of the disappearance of a very exploitative, power-addicted governing class, which is effectively your enemy. So I think that those themes will interweave, and I want to go through the specific benefits that I just outlined, that I think what I would call my system would provide. Now, the first thing is relentless, pervasive, uncompromising repatriation, the rollback of the multicultural, what I call the multicultural invasion. Now, and to do this, I ask you to do a thought experiment. Imagine you need to join up to a legal system in order to get the protection of law. And imagine there are two legal systems on offer, two areas, each with Area A offers a legal system that doesn't allow foreign populations in it. It only allows white British or English people in it. Foreign populations, say Muslim populations, or maybe sub-Saharan African populations, or some Eastern European populations, such as Romanians or the Baltic, Lithuanians or Latvians, that those people are not allowed in. So it's just for white British. Imagine Area B. That's the multicultural area. More multicultural, the better. The more the better. The black, brown, all kinds of people. Anyone is allowed in it. So, which one are you going to join? My case is that everyone, whatever their the vast majority of people, whatever their politics, will immediately join the white British area, the English area, because it makes simple. simple social and economic sense. If you have to pay subs to join a legal system because the enforcement mechanism, the police, the courts, the judges, the prisons, the bailiffs, that they all have to be paid for. If you allow more highly criminalised populations, which foreign populations are, if you allow more highly criminalised populations inside, that means more crime. That means you have to pay higher subs, more money for the privilege of being subjected to more crime in order to live in a society which has higher crime rates, which is bad for you even if you're not the immediate victim of that crime. So I think most people, the majority of people will, whatever their politics, will say, actually, I want to join the English area. I don't want to join the multicultural area B. And this is where I think the moral feedback loops that I talked about will come into play. So imagine that, let's say, half the population are hardline PC multiculturalists, and let's say so imagine half the population are like this macho gentleman.
It's politics, and I'm fed up of it, and it's about time we tear it to pieces. Should have been done a long time ago. Now, I was on a TV show today, and the topic was, should the government make cutting immigration its priority? That was, of course, after the publication of record numbers of people arriving in this country, or net immigration, more arriving than leaving. And it just struck me.
Okay, that's enough of him. Now, supposing hypothetically that half the population are like Owen Jones, and let's supposing I'm just taking him as a hypothetical example here. I don't know what he would decide, but let's suppose he says, no, I am not prepared to live in the white British area or the English area. I'm going to live in the multicultural area. And suppose half the population are like that, which I think is unlikely. Then what they will find is, living in area B, the multicultural area, suddenly the multicultural enrichment is twice as intense. The ratios are double what they were previously, and all jammed into a much smaller area. So you really have to live close to it. It's very difficult to get away from it. I think what you'll find is some of those people, imagine half the British population, imagine 35 million Owen Joneses in that area. Some of those Owen Joneses, I think, they might say to themselves, actually, I didn't really mind it when it was only 30% enriched, but now it's effectively 60% enriched and I can't get away from it. I think I'm going to quietly and discreetly go and join the English area to get away from all this multiculturalism. So then suppose half those people, the hardline multiculturalists who are in the multicultural area, then leave. Then the remaining multiculturalists who are in that multicultural area, they're no longer, they are now, the intensity of multiculturalism is now fourfold. It's 4 times what it was before, again in an even smaller area. And I think people will start to then say, actually, this is really uncomfortable and it's a bit dangerous. Half of them might leave, and then the ratio, the multicultural ratio is 8 times what it was. And people might say, actually, I'm not sure I can survive like this. And so people will gradually get out. I think you might get a few really hardline suicidal multiculturalists saying, I will stay here in the multicultural area to the death, and they might get their wish. And I think the opposite will be true, because I think people will say, we don't want it in the English area. I think people will say, we don't really want any exceptions. You may say that your former news agent, the Muslim news agent, was a really nice gentleman. He might have been a beardy weirdy in his silly cap and his lady's nightie, but I don't know him. I don't see why we should have him around. And how many others are we going to have around? What about my pal who was the delivery guy, who I used to like him? And people say, no, we need to be clear about this, and we just let's be straightforward. We just don't allow these people. If you want to live with your close to your former news agent because you like him so much, go and live in the multicultural area with him. So I think you will get through this the voluntary choice of what I would call freedom of association and freedom of non-association as well. I think that will drive quite a hardline sense of identitarianism and a rejection of multiculturalism and a relentless reversal of that multicultural tide. And Effectively, I think on the back of that, what you will see is the feedback loops that I talked about coming into play. On the back of that, the more people who do that, the more you will get in the English area a sense of togetherness, a sense of identity, a sense of enjoying being amongst, going back to a society where you're amongst people who look, think, act and speak like you and have very similar values, and you can predict how they will behave, and a sense of home as well on the back of identity, based on a sense of ethnicity. And I think that feedback loop, those feedback loops will be very strong. And I would expect in the English areas society to develop along very cohesive, quite nationalistic, identitarian lines, perhaps turbocharged by rejection of and shame about the decadence and invasion that we have so far submitted ourselves to. And I can see that happening just as an aside, I can see that happening in other areas as well. So with crime, I think people will say, I have no incentive to allow people with long criminal records in this area. Why would we? It means, again, I'm having to pay more money to police higher levels of crime that I might become the victim of. I have no reason to pay more money to be the victim of crime. Would you want the neighbourhood child abuser to live in your area? Would you want the neighbourhood drug dealer to live in your area? What about the neighbourhood car thief, the neighbourhood burglar? Probably not. You'll say, no, we don't want these people allowed to join. I want my area to be safe. I actually like the idea of not having to lock up every time I go out, not having to worry whether I lock the car. So in that sense, and I can, for instance, I can see similar tendencies emerging with drug use. People saying, actually, I don't particularly want drug use around me as well. So I don't think, although I think this would be a voluntary type society, a voluntary form of self-governing society, I don't think it will be a libertarian society. I don't think it will be a purely anarcho-capitalist society, simply because I think people will choose a much more moral, I would say even moralistic type of society. Now, is that entirely a good thing? You might say, well, it could be a little bit of a stifling, repressive atmosphere. I think people will will prefer it, and I think it's certainly a big improvement on the failing, self-destructive, sick society that we have in place at the moment. And above all, this is something that will work. It is a peaceful way to solve multiculturalism and the problems of multiculturalism. The state authorities cannot do it. State authorities can only use coercion. The tool of the state, the tools of the state are the truncheon and the gun. Coercion in this context means violence, and violence in this context means massacre, which I think will fail. So that's the first benefit. Rolling back, reversing the enriching effects of multiculturalism. And the second one is that I think a society along the lines of my system, a society based on my system, will be much wealthier, particularly for people who have to work for a living, particularly for poorer people. One, there won't be a taxman. It's easy to see how that makes people wealthier, not only wealthier, but much more entrepreneurial. Societies that have very low rates of tax tend to be very much more wealthy. Compare Taiwan with China. There are loads of examples of small societies that have low tax rates right next to oppressive societies that have high tax rates. And if you don't have the taxman in an English area governed by English law, you can guarantee that businesses from around the planet will come knocking on the door. They'll want to flood in because they no longer have to spend a lot of money on accountants to get them out of tax bills. They can simply go and set up in England amongst an educated, productive, lawful people with no tax burden, and it is really good for them. So they will want to come in, and the result of that, the main result of that, one of the main beneficiary will be working people, because labour in those circumstances is a fixed commodity. You can't increase the number of labourers. You can't suddenly give birth immediately to millions of full-grown workers. And so where you have a much richer, much more commercial society, where there is more demand for labour, but the supply of labour remains fixed, then the price of labour, wages, will go up, and especially without things like mass immigration and feminism. Mass immigration and feminism, these are not grassroots things. These have never been demanded by people. People have never voted to have these things imposed on us. These things are, there have been pressure groups that have arisen, but it has never been a pervasive society-wide ideology that people have demanded be imposed upon us. These things, mass immigration and feminism, are imposed upon us by the coercive state in order to reduce your rate of pay, to make you poorer, because that makes you more dependent and that makes you easier to rule, more manageable. The same with mass immigration. It is intended to grind you down. It is intended to make you poorer. It is intended to, as Hemingway put it, to make the grits cost more and the grunts cost less. If you don't have the overarching state, you won't have the whole mass immigration, multiculturalism, hate speech, public order around enrichment. You won't have that imposed, and you won't have the state imposing equal pay laws, equal value laws, the ferociously enforced laws about feminism in the workplace. That won't get imposed. Women will simply be paid according to their value. And I think a lot of women, that will cause, feminism will fail, and that will cause wage rates to go up, effectively returning to the situation in the 1950s, but probably more prosperous, when a single working man could buy a house and have a couple of cars for with his wife staying at home with the children, which is actually what women, when they're polled, consistently say they would rather do: stay at home with the children when they have young children. What I would see happening is that feedback loop happening again. Some women, perhaps with better paid husbands, will say, darling, you are doing well, you keep getting promoted, you keep getting a pay rise, and that means I can afford to stay at home, I can afford to it'll hit our living standards, but I can be at home with the children, taking care of the home and taking care of you, and we'll have a happier life. And then so some women go out of the workforce. As a result, that reduces the labour supply, that reduces that increases the level of wages, it increases supply and demand, means people get paid more men will start getting paid more women will then start saying, actually, I'd like to stay at home as well. Just like that lady up the road, you keep getting promoted, you keep getting a pay rise, so we can afford to do that. And I think women will simply retreat from the workforce, particularly women with children. And as a result of that, and I think you will actually get more children, because when you don't have the state providing you a pension, your children are your pension. So I think there'll be a return to family and child rearing, and that in turn will see women retreating from the workplace, which will see men's pay going up. And I think that is a feedback loop which will enhance, will increase prosperity, but particularly for people at the bottom, i.e. it will increase general equality in the way that the coercive state increases inequality through central banking, through multiculturalism and feminism. I can see that creating a saner society based on healthier sexual relationships. And I think this will be pushed further. I think this feedback loop of greater equality, more money for people at the bottom of the pile, will be enhanced by the lack of a central bank. You can only have a central bank if you have a coercive state that imposes a monopoly on money and monopoly control via a central bank. That is the purpose of the central bank, so that the state can intervene more intimately in your financial life. Without the central bank, I think there'll probably be a reversion to gold as a form of money. You can't print gold, so you don't have the Keynesian monetary control that you have under central banking. The purpose of central banking for the last few decades has been to increase the volume of money that is made available in society for businesses to borrow, to plough into speculative ventures. Certainly since the Blair years, since before the Blair years, what central banks have tried to do is to make money readily available to lend. So printing money, the central bank, the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, prints money and then goes to the big commercial banks and says there is this money available for you to borrow, to lend to customers if they want to borrow it. And that in turn reduces interest rates, and it encourages businesses to borrow in order to try and pump the economy, in order to increase tax takes so that governments can make welfare promises. But there's something that's called the Cantillon effect. It's named after a French economist. And what that is, what it says is when you print money and make it and lend it into the economy, the people it enriches are the people who get their hands on that money first of all. So it's a little bit like the analogy that I would use is, if there's a room containing 100 people, each one has £1 and each one has a loaf of bread. Effectively, a loaf of bread will sell for £1. If someone then comes to the door and then lends me £100, I can then buy up loaves of bread before everyone else realises that the number of pounds in the room has doubled. And so I buy up loaves of bread, and then gradually people realise that a loaf of bread is worth £2, but I've bought them all for £1. So I got my hands on that money first of all. That's a make-believe situation. What happens in society is that money gets pumped into the economy. It then goes into asset values like housing or shares or government bonds, and it pumps up the price. It pumps up asset values, and the price of the price of a home and the cost of rent, that goes up and up and up, and it effectively dilutes the money that working people earn. It renders working people poorer. I think it is intended to do so, because that then renders people more dependent, more reliant upon welfare. And the result of that is what a 19th century English economy referred to. He said that when central banks do that, they creating credit booms, which is what has happened, one big long credit boom for the last 30 years. When central banks create credit booms, it is as if the rich man is following the poor man at the plough and snatching the roots out of his hands as he digs. It is as unfair and unjust as that, by diluting the wealth, the money that ordinary working people can earn. Again, making the grits cost more and the grunts cost less. When you get rid of a central bank, or rather when you have a central bank, that encourages low interest rates, which encourages people to speculate in long-term speculative ventures, because the low interest rates are especially noticeable over long periods of time, year over year. They don't stack up in a curve, the amount stays low. So people will speculate on long-term ventures into the future. When you get rid of the central bank, what then has value is the production of value, tangible value now, today, and that effectively means labour. Labour starts to come into focus as a thing that people with money value, and that means that increases again the demand for labour, which makes people wealthier. There's another thing that a pet interest of mine that I think will affect the idea of equality within under the system I'm talking about. That is the idea of employee ownership. There is a tendency under the welfare state for people to rely on the fantasy wish, the fantasy notion that you don't have to worry about any grown-up problems, that they will be taken care of by the all-providing cradle-to-grave state, and that the state can, should and will take care of us. And we have become addicted to that. And when that happens, people will refuse to engage with ideas that a protection against ruthless employers, protection against the effects of inequality are in their own hands. People say, no, I'm not interested in that. Now, I appreciate that most people don't really care about inequality. Most people actually don't mind it. I think a lot of people quite like inequality. They find it kind of fun. I don't believe the left-wing idea that people are in rebellion against inequality. I think the opposite is the case. I think inequality is a problem because it creates conflicts of interest in society. We're undergoing one of those now, which is that income tax is paid overwhelmingly by a small portion of the population. That means the rest of us have an incentive to vote for ever-increasing welfare provision, which eventually collapses the state. We're going through the late stages of that at the moment. And fundamentally, that is inequality that's at the bottom of that. A very unequal society will create conflicts of interest which undermine it. So I do think it is a problem. I think if you get rid of the welfare state, that forces people, that pushes people's nose into the issues around inequality, unscrupulous employers, and I think that will encourage people to get into more entrepreneurial methods, more self-starting methods to try to solve that. I think probably that means employee ownership, but that is not, those kind of solutions are not something that people will look to whilst the welfare state maintains its pretensions. When the state falls over, when there's no longer the welfare state, then I think people will sensibly start looking to address the issue of inequality themselves, because I think people will be exposed to the effects of it more directly. And I certainly think that any society that where people get to grips with such ideas will thrive and prosper like no other society ever has in history. But my main point is that under the system that I'm proposing, i.e. joining a legal system voluntarily as by individual consent, I think under that kind of system, without the coercive state, I think it will be more prosperous, particularly for people at the bottom, ordinary working people. So a little bit more equal for that. And the third benefit, I think, it relates to culture. I think that what I call my system will create a much more healthier culture. I mean, in day-to-day cultural interactions between people, but also in artistic culture, which I don't think is to be underestimated. And I think the basic strapline, the carry-home message, is that the state, or the democratic state, plus the welfare state equal decadence. They create decadent, degenerate societies. And firstly, if I go through that in detail, the idea of one person, one vote, I think creates the belief that there certainly is the right to equal access to coercive state power, i.e. that we are, and that in turn creates a fiercely held illusion that everyone is of equal value, which we are not all of equal value. That's just a lie. But it creates that political illusion. Everyone has an equal right to be happy, but some people are more valuable than others. I am not as valuable as Shakespeare. Loads of other people more valuable than me, unfortunately. And on the back of that, the idea comes forward that taste and culture should fall to a level that everyone can access, that everyone's tastes, no matter how low and effortless they are, how uncultivated they are of equal value. And the idea of cultivation of taste, of education of taste, the development of taste, that actually becomes a ridiculous, old-fashioned idea that's repressive and in fact a crime against the ideology of supposed equality. And that is then when it is that militates against artistic culture. The main driver, the individual driver for creating artistic culture is pride. People are driven by a sense of pride to show what they can do, what they can provide, what they can create, almost to say, look how valuable I am, look what an impressive person I am. You can see loads of quotes from Jane Austen to Mozart to Beethoven. I mean, I'll give you one quote from Beethoven. He came out with quite a lot of these. What are you? What you are by accident of birth. What I am by myself. There are and will be 1,000 princes, there is only one Beethoven. And that's what drove him to produce the masterpieces he produced. Jane Austen came up with, talked similarly about a novel with great pride. And it is the idea that all tastes that anyone has, what you pin to your fridge under a fridge magnet is of equal to what you might see in the Louvre. That's just nonsense. But it's favoured by, I think, the supposed equality of the democratic state. And that then is taken to another level is made worse if you then add the welfare state to it, because that then adds not only the illusion of equal access to coercive power, but it adds this sense of equal entitlement. I'm entitled to receive things in order I have an equal entitlement to goods, to things, to material possessions. And this encourages a sort of a general ethos, a social atmosphere of of respecting, that we should respect and cater to the lowest forms of taste, simply because they're easy to access and understand and don't require any work. And then the idea of cultivation of taste is not only irrelevant, it's actually a bit of a crime. And you can see how this develops. I think there's a good example of this in the behaviour of this thug.
You need elocution classes, you need a day in the slums. Fucking go to your community and go around to all those people that look up to you and be real, you fucking fake!
Hey,
Oh!
That is a thug and a bully screaming and swearing at somebody who has better manners than her, because she feels that that person's better manners undermine her right to be considered equal to everyone, no matter what. She perceives good manners as a crime against her right to self-respect and self-esteem. And that's the result of the democratic welfare state, whether you like it or not. And that again is enhanced in another way by loose monetary policy, central banking. When you have central banking, they will try to reduce interest rates, try to make more money available for people to borrow, and that favours consumption, because you can get money cheaply now. Instead of deferring gratification, you'll say, no, I can gratify myself now, I can consume today. And what you will get is higher volumes of repeated consumption of low quality. What matters is not the quality. The idea of savouring food, again, becomes one of those old-fashioned, outdated, repressive ideas, a silly idea, a Victorian idea. And what is favoured is then poor quality but large volume, repeatedly indulged in. You can see that with food, and you can see it with music. It's very, if you go into town, go around a shopping centre, it's very hard to get away from music. Most of it of rubbish quality, and these are basic attitudes to consumption which are put in place by money. People's attitudes to money. Money is a powerful force, and the central bank policy, loose monetary policy, low interest rates, they will do that to a society. Get rid of a central bank, you will find that society will become more cultured, both in just day-to-day manners, between interactions between people, but also artistically. I think that is a benefit. So those are the three main benefits of the system that I propose. What I with some hubris call my system, the idea of a system where people voluntarily sign up to join a legal code, based on its authority is based upon people's individual consent, without the coercive state stamping down on people. I think that is, to go through those three things again, firstly, reversing and very relentlessly, uncompromisingly reversing the multicultural invasion through effective repatriation, pervasive, widespread repatriation. Secondly, by creating a much more prosperous society, particularly for people who have to work for a living. And the third thing is through general culture, manners and artistic culture. I could talk about a lot of different benefits that I could foresee to the type of system that I'm proposing. But finally, really what I would say is my system is possible. The continuation of the current system, it is not. And the idea that you're going to get any improvement under the current system, I hope the latest immigration, I think that has killed that idea amongst quite a lot of people. I think a lot of people have passed from the point of view that it is fulminating at politicians is a workable strategy, it's a workable idea, to saying actually this will never work. They will never cease being traitorous about this. It will fail. It is you're on hiding to nothing simply by fulminating at politicians and fulminating about politicians. Politicians want mass immigration. It renders you harmless, it renders you ground down, more manageable, easier to rule, and therefore renders them more powerful. So they're going to increase it. I mean, they're not going to reduce it. And the result of it's not only in that area that the society is sick. It is dysfunctional and self-destructive in many other ways. And whatever you might say about my system, it will take some doing for the system I'm proposing to be even more sick, dysfunctional, and self-destructive than the current system. So I think it offers a lot of benefits, and it is not something that we need to be afraid of. And this is my motive for explaining this, for trying to put this forward, for doing this nerdy work, explaining something that's alienating and unfamiliar to people, because what I want to get across is if, I would say when, the current system collapses, that is not something that you have to panic about. You don't have to fear it. It might in fact lead to something better. I think it will lead to something better. And therefore you don't have to lose it. You don't have to act as if the sky has fallen in and just look for someone to get and someone to punish. You can say, well, this might lead to something better. We can now get on with managing our own lives and managing a better society. I think that's what will happen along the lines that I've suggested here. Thank you.